Thank you very much. Before I start my official 12 minutes, I really want to thank Michael Murphy, Maureen Bartram, and Howard Coombs, the visiting defense fellows, the cadets, and especially the students who are here. I was you 20 years ago. This is how I got my start. And if it wasn't for the KCIS, and these defense centers and this relationship that we foster, I would not be here today. So what I want to do is the classic academic levels of analysis, and we're going to go through this slide. We'll start in the top left-hand side. We'll go down and finish up on the top right-hand side. My bottom line up front is that there are many, many actors and moving parts in the Arctic. And one of the biggest problems is going to be coordinating, integrating, understanding, and making sure that the various mandates and jurisdictions are not actually creating seams and gaps that can be exploited by our adversaries. The other thing I think is helpful to think about, and it's a heuristic that Dr. Whitney Lackenbauer has created specifically for the Arctic, because we tend to think of it as this one homogeneous region. But to think of it in terms of threats in, through, and to the Arctic, it tends to make for more strategic thinking. So a threat in the Arctic might be an oil spill. A threat through the Arctic are the many, many missiles that are coming over the Arctic because it's the fastest avenue of approach. And then the biggest threat to the Arctic, which is climate change. Many of the threats in the Arctic are actually from away. They are not part and parcel of the Arctic, but it is simply becomes, in many ways, the unwitting pawn that has to deal with all of this churn. So let's start with the global context. First of all, you're going to notice that there's a terminology difference. When we're talking about the high north, that is your cue. We are talking about a NATO context or a Nordic or European context. They tend to use that terminology. And that's also because their main concern tends to be in a maritime domain. The big threat that we've heard about, of course, is the Russian and its bastion defense, and especially the Koala Peninsula and the fact that it has the bulk of its second strike capability that is housed in that area. And so this and the GI-UK gap, the Greenland, Iceland, UK, Norway gap, it has been the main source of concern and consternation ever since the Cold War. Interestingly, EUCOM, and the EUCOM commander, of course, is also the NATO Supreme Allied Commander, and they have the lead on all things Russia. But as we know, there are many different parts to the Arctic that we're going to see. U.S. Northcom, of course, their area of responsibility certainly has a Russian nexus, and EUCOM remains sort of the lead thinker on Russia, even though U.S. Northcom is also the U.S. military's Arctic military advocate. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. On the U.S., Canada, and I would add Russia side, we refer to the Arctic. And our concern has, in a North American context, has really been the air domain. And that puts the North American Aerospace Defense Command as the first line of defense. And if you haven't seen it yet, I encourage you to Google for the U.S. Defense Intelligence Assessment map, the Golden Dome map, that shows the myriad air threats and missiles that use the Arctic Ocean as the fastest avenue of approach that are a considerable threat, and why there is so much discussion about integrated air and missile defense, a much better term than talking about golden domes, iron domes, things like that. That's really what we're talking about. When it comes to threats of concern, Russia, they say, is their persistent proximate threat. But China and Russia have only partnered in air and maritime operations in the Bering Strait and around the Aleutian Islands. And here we have a seam with Indo-PACOM and US Northcom, which is a bit problematic because Indo-PACOM has the bulk of US Northcom's assets. It is certainly concerned about China as the pacing threat, but North America and NATO are squarely focused on the North Atlantic and the Arctic approaches. So already we have a bit of a blind spot. NORAD has a maritime warning mission, something I think, honestly, they forget. I'm looking at you, Blaze Frawley. NORAD also has a global area of operations for warning purposes, something I also think they forget and really need to lean into. So this maritime warning function is about processing, assessing, and then disseminating intelligence, creating a common picture, and then warning and advising of potential threats to North America. This mission has been up and running since 2006, but I still get the impression that when it comes to maritime warning, it is the, weird stepchild in the corner that nobody knows what to do. They've shuffled them from the J3 operations to the J2 intelligence. I really think in today's context and given the importance of the Arctic, that maritime warning mission has never been more important, and that global area of operations needs to be exploited because NORAD is doing stuff over here, NATO is doing stuff over there. There is a lovely seam right in the middle, and guess where Russia often operates. The other thing we do is we often have exercises. So we'll have Arctic Edge in Alaska, Operation Nuke in Canada, Cold Response in Norway, often within weeks of each other, with absolutely no indication that this was planned or not, that we have a strategic message or not in terms of what we're exercising and what we're doing. And again, we are losing that opportunity to strategically message to our adversaries that we actually know what we're doing and we have a plan. The big problem is that with the events in Ukraine, the Arctic Council is on all but diplomatic hiatus. The NATO-Russia Council is all but dead. The Arctic Security Working Group doesn't include Russia. The Arctic Coast Guard Forum doesn't include Russia. We have very few tension valves that we can operate to, have a discussion with especially Russia because of the hybrid threats, the GPS jamming. The U.S. Coast Guard has direct communication with Russia's border guards. And Norway has a red phone with Russia, but man, that took a lot of doing. The rest of us have very few ways or opportunities to make sure that accidents, incidents, and misperceptions don't all of a sudden escalate into tension. Here we have the various players, especially in a North American context. And I want to note that we have not talked about Joint Force Command Norfolk, which is a NATO command in the United States, twinned with the Second Fleet. Its mandate is from Florida to Finnmark, seabed to seafloor. It is a joint multinational command, but really the focus is very much on the maritime spaces right now. And there's an excellent opportunity, again, for us to marry and exercise and integrate the information we have from a maritime warning context and a NATO context, and to do some more exercising. If we go up to this picture of the Northwest Passage, I want to point out for you just how shallow it is, how difficult it is to navigate, And it will become more, not less, ice-choked as climate change progresses. And that's because of the various currents. And as, for example, the Greenland ice sheet melts, it's getting slammed back through the Northwest Passage. So I think we have to be careful before we assume that there is going to be lots of traffic going through there. Now, the Canadian Coast Guard is absolutely critical to the maritime domain awareness in our Northwest Passage. They have done more than any organization to forge relationships with the Arctic communities. The Inuit peoples are maritime peoples, and through things like the CCG Auxiliary and other programs that they run, the Longboat program, it really is the Coast Guard, which is the persistent Canadian government presence in the Arctic, and they are absolutely essential for resupply, for search and rescue, and with Bill C-12, could have a security and intelligence mandate as well. This is on top of them moving to D&D. This is a lot of moving parts, potentially game-changing. And certainly this is going to reinforce the Arctic operating picture that's created out of Halifax at the Marine Security Operations Center East. It's not an operations center. That's a misnomer. It really is about coordinating intelligence and information. But that relationship and making sure that this Canadian Coast Guard gets the training, the sensors, the assistance they need for that role is so important and vital in an Arctic context, because it is the Arctic that gives us the largest coastline in the world. The other thing I want to mention is the RCN has absolutely no mandate to monitor Canadian waters. They're in our historic internal waters. There's a bit of a disconnect here that we need to wrestle with and think about as we go forward. And then finally, up to what we do nationally, we have a tendency to create policies, rarely strategies. Policies are aspirational. Strategies say you only have this number of ships and this number of personnel. Here are the clear priorities. And what we are all loath to do is to ask the question, if you're asking me to do more, what am I not going to do anymore? And we are trying to change the tires on a car careening down the highway. And it is going to get always messy before it gets better. So to wrap up, I want to leave us with some opportunities. But first, I want to recommend to you that maritime domain awareness is going to be our Achilles heel. Everyone struggles with it. The more we can do to share information, the better. But to opportunities. In a global level, we really have to think about how we, for example, coordinate our exercises and lean into the fact that we are an alliance. We are still tending to be very stovepiped, and China and Russia love that. In fact, they exploit it on a regular basis. In a North American context, we have to consider that while our attention is focused almost uniquely on the North Atlantic and into the Arctic, we are leaving exposed the Pacific, and we have not thought about that carefully. What, if anything, we can do? We're just hoping the U.S. Coast Guard, who I don't think is here, we're just hoping they've got it. And finally, on a national side, that transition of the Coast Guard to D&D is critical. I fear a lot of this is going to happen at their busiest times. The resupply of the Arctic hamlets absolutely cannot stop. And we have to be careful that more government presence in the Arctic is not taking away from the vital resources of Arctic communities. And finally, we need to manage expectations. We have the Oprah Winfrey approach to budgets these days. You get some money, and you get some money, and you get some money. And everybody is just sort of importing what they think that money can do for them. And especially in an Arctic context, that is really problematic. The CAF and D&D money will not produce new schools. It will not necessarily clean the drinking water. It will not improve the fact that any air transport is going north to south, very little east to west, which mitigates against development. We have lots to do, but we can do it. Thank you.